This is the next to last, we think, event for the Sawyer Seminar in Contemporary Political Struggle. The name of the seminar has changed several times. It has a bit of an odd history. A bunch of us who really are not the kind of people who get big grants were sitting around one day, and someone else who did get a big grant said, I got another job, I'm leaving, take my grant money, please. And we were like, okay. So we took the grant money and sort of changed the direction of the grant a little bit over the course of this year. We're grateful for that opportunity because it gives us the chance to have events like this event today under the heading of the Sawyer Seminar for Contemporary Political Struggle. I want to thank Emily and Justin, who are my collaborators on the seminar. I want to offer a special thanks to Candice Lynn, a friend down at UCLA who did the poster designs for this, which I think are really lovely posters, and has done a bunch of work for us. I also want to thank Elliot and Gina, and especially Catherine Wallerstein at the Davis Humanities Institute for co-hosting and sharing their infrastructure with us. With that, I'd like to pass the mic to Catherine for a second to talk about the DHI and an event or two coming up. Catherine?
Hello. It's wonderful to be co-hosting this event with you, Joshua, and to be welcoming such an astounding group of speakers. I'm very excited to have you all here. Just basically two brief announcements. One, a recording of this event will be up on our website by next week. So everybody should, who wants to get a recording or share it with someone who is not able to attend the event, should go to our website, which I think Emily is going to put in the chat. And that is dhi.ucdavis.edu. And while you're on the website, you can check out our other events and opportunities and get yourself on our mailing list if you like, to keep apprised of future events like this one. And then lastly, I just want to announce our next big event, which will be on May 20th at 5:10 p.m. And that will be the third in a series of events on Sacramento, bringing together artists and scholars and community advocates to talk about the past, present, and future of the city. So please tune in for that. And with that, I will hand it back over to Joshua and to Charmaine, and I'm going to disappear. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Catherine. While I'm thanking people, I also want to thank my colleagues in the racial capitalism cluster here at UC Davis, who didn't play an official role in this event, but have greatly improved the atmosphere for militant study. While I'm mentioning future events and militant scholars, this seminar's final major event of the year will be on May 19th, which is a Wednesday at this time, so 12 o'clock West Coast, 3 o'clock East Coast. We'll host a discussion on riot logistics, a name which indicates both the logistical character of the contemporary riot, particularly the George Floyd Rebellion, as well as its entanglement with the transformation of global capital known as the logistics revolution. Speakers for that event will include Shimon Salam, Nick Dyer-Witherford, I'll be joining in, and Charmaine Shua, about whom more to come. Information and registration will be available in the usual places, including the DHI website. There are many backstories to today's event, and maybe the simplest one is just to say that my comrades and I spend a lot of time and organizing effort working toward the horizons of communism and abolition. And it seems helpful to hear extremely thoughtful people talk about how those horizons might line up. The X in the title of this event, Abolition X Communism, indicates neither opposition nor identity, but something like crossover. Speaking in particular of organizing toward abolition, I want to mention a couple of things upcoming. The continent-wide Cops Off Campus Coalition is organizing a day of walkout and work refusal on May 3rd. That's a week from Monday, wherein students and workers across the UC system and the continent, including here at UC Davis, will refuse to hold or attend classes or to conduct university business. Here at Davis, there will be an actual live socially distanced gathering for those committed to the principled abolition of policing on campus. We're dropping some links in the chat right now that will provide information if you'd like and are interested in joining or taking part. May 3rd is the beginning of Abolition May, a month of events from Davis to Harvard, University of Illinois to UW, demanding cops off campus, and finally, cops off the planet. If you are part of a campus abolition project and would like to join the Cops Off Campus Coalition, you should feel welcome to contact the organizers of this event or go to the COCC link you'll find in the chat. And there's lots of ways to sign up, get involved, make contacts, know people, and generally be part of it. And we encourage you to do that. Another way to narrate this event involves January 6th. In some ways, that was the most aggressive of anti-abolitionist gatherings in recent times. If the Capitol insurrectionists fought police and threatened politicians, it was only because, in their measure, these figures were not repressive enough, not violent enough, not committed enough to a regime of subordination and hierarchy arranged by race and class, among other things. They wanted the police to be more police. It's a disturbing thought. But it was no less bizarre to read the conversations recorded by one journalist among those insurrectionists. Over and over, 7 times in a single article, the ragged edge of white supremacy declared that it was about communism, that communism was the enemy. Why are these two things, occasionally a matter of debate on the left, so inextricable in the minds of reaction and in the party of order? That is one way to formulate my own curiosity. I do not think it is a simple question. That's why I'm grateful we have extremely thoughtful people here with us today. After they present and share some conversation, we'll open to broader discussion. As I mentioned, if you do have questions for that discussion, please hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel and ask your questions there rather than in chat. Thinking of our panelists, introductions are always too much or too little. I had always meant to plan an event where the speakers truly needed no introduction. Looking at the audience size today, I think we are finally there, and I'll keep that promise. But we'll try to drop some links into the chat relevant to each of our speakers as they come up with information, links to texts they've written, talks they've given. I will, however, offer a brief introduction to our moderator, not because she needs one, but because we are specially indebted to her. Charmaine Chua, whose remarkable scholarship I gestured toward above regarding logistics and international struggle, is not a UC Davis, but has been nonetheless a stalwart and true friend of this seminar and of the Davis Humanities Institute, generously participating in multiple events, including the May 19th event that I mentioned. She's also a true comrade. I welcome you all again and now pass the microphone to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, for that incredibly generous introduction. I want to just start by acknowledging that I speak or come to you from Santa Barbara, which is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Chumash and Island Chumash peoples, who are currently engaged in an ongoing struggle to save the last native grassland in the San Marcos foothills from being developed by real estate capitalists. So it is my great honor and pleasure to bring together a wonderful and incredible group of scholars today. This event brings together our favorite thinkers of both abolition and communism, not thought of as official uppercase ideologies, but as lowercase ideas about how we might organize social existence. While some would say that each implies the other, tensions between the two traditions have also proliferated in some debates. Some interpreters have opposed anti-racism to class analysis, decolonial thought to Marxism, the Global South and Eurocentrism, among other oppositions, while others, including scholars on this panel, have insisted on the historical and contemporary links between Black, anti-racist, and communist struggles, and on the manifold ways in which counter-revolutionary capitalism, anti-communism, and white supremacy are co-constitutive of racial capitalism. Such considerations have taken on ever greater significance amid the ongoing horrors of police violence within the explosion of the carceral state and the intensifications of capitalist collapse. And we need to look no further than the fact that on the day that Derek Chauvin was convicted on all 3 counts, that at the same moment, Ma'Khia Bryant was shot to death in Columbus, Ohio. So this discussion provides an opportunity for these scholars, organizers to consider the overlaps and consonances, as well as the necessary and prospective relations between abolition and communism, as well as potential lacks thereof. So what we'll do is invite each panelist to speak for 10 minutes each, and we'll go in the following order. Charisse Burden-Stelly will begin, Sylvia Fedorici will go next, then Kathy Weeks, and then we'll close with Joy James. And we are really excited about this. We'll then invite panelists to respond to each other, after which I may take the prerogative to pose a question of my own, and then we'll open to a Q&A, hopefully by 4:30, if not before. So Charisse, please go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sort of, it's my pleasure, and I'm also humbled to be here this afternoon. I'm not certain what exactly I can add to a panel on communism and abolition with Joy James, Kathy Weeks, and Sylvia Fedorici, but I will attempt to contribute something worthwhile to the conversation. And so I want to start with two quotes, one from Angela Davis's chapter, Racialized Punishment in Prison Abolition. She writes, "The prison's purpose is not so much to transform, but to concentrate and eliminate politically dissident and racialized populations." So today I want to think with this elimination of the politically dissident, especially racialized political dissidents. The second quote is from Benjamin J. Davis Jr. He writes, quote, "The fact that there is no special status for political prisoners in the United States is more evidence of the backwardness of our social system. In Europe, even prior to World War II, such a status existed in many capitalist European countries. If the more human penologists were inclined to grant a more humane status to political prisoners, the McCarrans and Joe McCarthys and other flag wavers around would hound them out of public life," end quote. So here, Davis points out that to be a political dissident makes you a criminal in the context of the United States. They see no distinction, right? And so my work on anti-communism and anti-Blackness, or the Red Scare and the Black Scare, has conveyed to me that, especially in the context of the United States, communism and abolition need to be thought together, not least because anti-communism and criminalization and anti-radicalism and carcerality more broadly have worked together in expansive ways. And so just to define some terms, Black Scare is defined as a specter of racial, social, and political economic domination of superior whites by inferior Black populations and the mobilization of this idea. And the Red Scare is operationalized as the threat of anti-capitalist takeover, infiltration, and disruption of the American way of life, articulated through the specter of the communist and the fellow traveler. So I'm actually in Philadelphia right now. I'm here for the weekend of events around Mumia Abu-Jamal, whose birthday is on Saturday, and the efforts to free Mumia. And I am here because Mumia Abu-Jamal, who has been labeled a cop killer, has been subjected to untold forms of violence, terrorism, and repression that have affected his health, his freedom, his sociality, etc. And Mumia, to me, and he is subjected to this repression because he dared to defend the MOVE organization, and he dared to tell the truth about the bombing of the MOVE organization. And so there's a way in which political dissidents that are truth tellers are labeled criminals, and therefore extraordinary violence is weaponized against them. And when I think of Mumia Abu-Jamal, I think of Benjamin J. Davis Jr., who was convicted in 1949 for being a member of the Communist Party. And he, in fact, was in prison for 3 years and 4 months, the longest sentence that any of the co-defendants received. So he and Henry Winston, the other Black defendant, received the longest sentences. And what Davis said was that he believed it was the purpose of the court to give him the maximum sentence to intimidate and terrorize all militant Negroes, and to serve notice that a fight for free and equal citizenship would be met with swift reprisal. So here again, I think we see the deep relationship between criminalization, imprisonment, policing, and anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism. And so this is how I come to see the importance of abolition and communism. Of course, when I think about Benjamin J. Davis Jr., I must also think about Angelo Herndon, because Benjamin J. Davis Jr. he's a lawyer, right? And he was one of Angelo Herndon's lawyers. And Angelo Herndon was arrested and convicted of insurrection in 1932, simply because he led a demonstration of unemployed Black and white workers to City Hall. And they successfully were able to garner more resources in the context of the Great Depression. He also was found with communist pamphlets in his possession. And because he vehemently defended freedom for Black people and Black liberation and an end to exploitation of the white masses, he was considered to be dangerous and an insurrectionist. That is to say, his Blackness and his communism rendered him a criminal. And insurrection, at that moment, the penalty for that was the death penalty. The mercy that the jury came to, the merciful sort of sentence that they recommended was life in prison. And so I think these people, these Black communists who were jailed starting basically in 1932 and moving through the Cold War are really some of the most pronounced victims, the most pronounced political prisoners. And they kind of laid the foundation for untold political prisoners throughout the 1960s and 1970s who are struggling for Black liberation, because that anti-communist architecture of surveillance, harassment, delegitimization, and criminalization was then meted out against the Black Panther Party, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Black Liberation Army, and other Black radicals who are struggling against the combination of exploitation and oppression. And so it seems to me that if we're going to have freedom dreams, it seems to me if we're going to think of a world beyond militarism, capitalism, imperialism, and forms of structural and material lack that decrease the life chances of racialized, oppressed, and poor people, we need to think seriously about communism and about abolition. In her statement before the court in 1953, Claudia Jones really talked about the importance of the abolition of what we now call the prison industrial complex. She realized that she was being criminalized for being a communist. And what the other thing she pointed out was important to her conviction were informants and stool pigeons. Now, when we think about communism, or when we think about anti-communism, when we think about carcerality, we have to think about what types of subjects it produces. It produces people whose livelihoods are predicated on the destruction of communities and the telling of lies and stories to throw people behind bars simply because they believe particular ideas, right? The Smith Act and later the McCarran Act were constructed to criminalize people for ideas, for daring to think something that challenged capitalism and that challenged the racial hierarchy endemic in US society. And so in order to think about political democracy or economic democracy, we have to abolish not only prisons, not only policing, but also the systems that circumscribe even the ability to think about freedom and to think about liberation in any fundamental way. Jones goes on to say, right, that her incarceration and the ways in which her case was set up, including jury selection, represented a fear of the people. And I think that both anti-communism and carcerality and the prison industrial complex represent a deep fear of the people. And what it does, what all of this does is circumscribe the way that we relate to one another, right? And the ability to think about how it is that we might relate to each other beyond violence, beyond suspicion, and beyond relations that are not life affirming, right? Finally, Jones says that she intimates essentially that to be a Negro in America is to be a criminal. That is to say, everything about Negro life and Negro survival is criminalized, and that Black people are convicted just for being Black, right? And so in my perspective, the issue of race, the issue of Blackness, especially in the United States, needs to be at the center of our interrogations of both communism and of abolition, because of the way in which race and the construction of Blackness are at the center of how the United States has understood accumulation, has understood punishment, has understood discipline, and has understood the limits of things like freedom and citizenship. And so for me, when I think about communism and abolition and what brings them together, I think with Black communist thinkers like Doxy Wilkerson, like W.E.B. Du Bois, like Louise Thompson Patterson, and I can go on, because they fundamentally were thinking about a world beyond imperialism, warmongering, racism, sexism, patriarchy, and carcerality. That is to say, they're thinking about a world that was fundamentally rooted in abolition and in communism. So I'll stop there.
10 minutes right on time. Thank you so much, Charisse. I forgot to just say that in lieu of reading out the excellent intros for each speaker, since they need no introduction, that I've just been pasting them in the chat to maximize our time to be in conversation with each other. So next up is Sylvia Fedorici.
Hello to everybody, greetings. My contribution is going to be simple, some reflection on the general concept. First of all, communism. And I want to say there are many concepts of communism. So I want to spell out what communism means to me in the positive sense. Some of the realization of communism historically have not been so positive. So it's always important to clarify what we mean by it. And to me, it means a society that is not built on exploitation, in which there is equal access to the wealth, the natural wealth and the social wealth that is produced. You know, a society that is based on cooperation and not on competition. A society, above all, that is self-governed. In fact, to me, communism, one of the things to make clear when we speak of communism is whether we think of it as a statist model or not. And certainly I don't believe that communism is a state model, because I believe the state is an organ of social repression. Now, clearly, if this is what communism is, undoubtedly, clearly, abolition has to be, and abolition too. Abolition has to be intended in the broadest sense. We begin with abolition of the police, but also abolition of exploitation. I mean, the abolitionist struggle in the United States is, you know, we know its roots have been in the movement against slavery, in the struggle against slavery. So there is a profound connection between all the institutions of repression that have been formed in the United States, have been created in the United States and beyond, and the different forms of enslavement. So the moment you abolish, you cannot really abolish police brutality or the institution of repression that exists today, which includes also the jails, includes the capital punishment. We need to place the struggle against capital punishment at the very center of the struggle for abolition, you know, without at the same time, you know, eliminating the exploitation of labor. And this means that the struggle for abolition has to be at the same time, hand in hand, simultaneously, you know, a struggle for the change of the material conditions of our life. It has to be at the same time. So as crucial as it is, you know, to campaign for defunding the police, you know, for putting an end to every carceral system, and certainly essential to all of it, you know, to abolish the death penalty. You know, we also have to put the struggle for a major restructuring of the distribution of wealth, and above all, restructuring of the organization of production. So the question of an anti-capitalist struggle understood in the broadest sense, changing the systemic foundation of this society is a necessary aspect, a necessary moment of the struggle against abolition. I want to say something now about the present and about the future, you know, because when we speak, for instance, just in terms of calling for the defunding and the abolition of the police, we also have to think of the alternative. And I think that this implies also to conceptualize, you know, a major level of organization in our community, like to create the kind of infrastructures. I would say that, you know, if the future towards which we want to move is a society that is self-governed, that is not exploitative, not built on the exploitation of work on any other form, not built on social hierarchies, inequality, racism, sexism, and is a society where we have equal access to the social wealth. Then we also need to begin to organize from the present forms of self-government in our community. This implies a whole broad level of reorganization, of restructuring, of creation of new form of cooperation in the way we reproduce ourselves on a day-to-day basis, and also in which we take responsibility. And, you know, I've been spending some time recently, you know, looking at system of justice in other societies, for example, indigenous societies of the America that are built on restorative conception of justice. Also system of justice that, you know, several communities, indigenous communities in Canada have been able to organize, you know, again, built on restoration. And it's a tremendous struggle, but it's a very powerful one, because it means that in a way you start from the present to organize in a way in which the community comes together and takes on those functions of protection that supposedly the police, this is what is used to justify the presence of the police in the community, which of course is exactly the opposite, right? So I think that that kind of organizing, that kind of thinking is very important today, you know, to, in other words, that the struggle against, you know, will be all the more successful if it is also a struggle for something, if it is also has immediately a constructive element. And by construction, I mean precisely, you know, the creation of a different social fabric, the bringing together of all the organizations that are fighting in different ways for social justice at the community level, to begin to form, you know, a kind of counter-government, a kind of counter-power that can start again from the present to take on, you know, those tasks that we are told, this institution, you know, we are told justify the existence of this institution. And we know that in fact, it's exactly the opposite. So I think I'm going to stop here and, you know, in the discussion, perhaps work more in detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Next is Kathy Weeks.
Thanks. I'm speaking from Seattle, which I want to acknowledge is the traditional land of the Duwamish people. I wanted to thank Joshua, Kathy, Emily for organizing all of this, and Charmaine for moderating, and my fellow panelists for all of their amazing work. So the categories of our prompt, abolition and communism, could be explored on a number of different registers, with abolition cast more generally as a larger history of struggles against white supremacy, and communism indexed to anti-capitalist struggles more broadly. My references are going to be more specific, as I'm going to focus not only on prison abolitionism more narrowly, but Angela Davis's writings on that topic on the one side, and mostly the US Marxist feminist tradition on the other. So these are some thoughts from something that I'm writing about US Marxist feminism as a kind of broad archive. And part of that work has been thinking about the complicated and I think enormously generative relationships between Angela Davis's prison abolitionist writings, which I read as in many ways a piece of her larger body of anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and feminist work, and the Marxist feminist archive, with which she is rarely recognized as a leading figure, as she should be. Here too, there are infinite possibilities for thinking abolition and communism or Marxism in relationship or together. For example, bringing abolition to bear on Marxism requires Marxism and feminism to theorize and confront the material histories of a fully racial and patriarchal capitalism. And to note another example, too, along with Marxist feminists like Sylvia Fedorici, to demand that Marxism rewrite the history of primitive accumulation to recognize the many ways that the bloody origins of capitalist accumulation did not give way to the silent compulsion of economic forces, but rather continues to rely on violent forms of coercion, including the prison. Finally, just one more example, prison abolitionism charges Marxism to understand the range of ways, and prison is key here, that capitalism can manage its surplus populations who are not successfully disciplined by the wage or family. But I'm interested in the potential for synergies at a higher level of abstraction that I'm going to call methodological. That is, I'm interested in what prison abolitionism has to offer beyond its own rubric in some ways, by following the model of Davis, who identifies and distills and puts to use other theoretical and practical traditions like feminism in terms of the framework of analysis. And that's what I'm trying to isolate here, the method of abolitionism, or a framework of analysis. I've come to appreciate Davis as a superb methodologist who draws from and creatively incorporates multiple theoretical and political apparatuses. So I want to follow her lead in approaching both Marxism and feminism, and now in my case, abolition, as specific methods of thinking relationally, rather than just a set of objects of study or concepts or contents. I'm interested in approaching abolitionism as a method with a distinctive theoretical infrastructure that can be applied to other theoretical and political domains. And it's at this level of abstraction that I think the compatibilities between abolitionism and Marxism are most apparent. In this way, I'm reading prison abolitionism as a demand on the model of, or using the template of, 1970s wages for housework, and another shout out to Sylvia's brilliant contributions. Wages for housework insisted that their demand be understood as both a larger theoretical perspective and a political provocation. That is, in terms of the critical analyses that inform the demand, explain the demand, lead to the demand, and in terms of the pedagogical force of the demand and its perspective as people articulate and struggle for it. So that's just one illustration of how I've been trying to read one project, abolition, through the lens of another, in this case, wages for housework, and in the process not being entirely faithful to either one. So read as method, Davis's prison abolitionism requires that we stretch our sociological and political imaginations, that we broaden our critical diagnoses and lengthen our temporalities of change. So there's two key elements of abolition as a method of political theory, in my view. And I name them structuralism and utopianism. And first, by structuralism, I'm not referring to any one school of philosophy, each with its own recipe of which structures are important and how they relate. I mean structuralism as an aspiration to systems thinking with a focus on social structures, along with their ideological and discursive support systems. The prison is an institution situated within a larger ecosystem of other institutions and ideologies, from the wage and family system and their exclusions, to immigration policies under neoliberal accumulation, and the institutional racisms that are the living legacy of slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. Davis describes the prison industrial complex as a system of systems. To understand it properly, we have to cultivate a structuralist sociological imagination that runs counter to the deeply ingrained habits of methodological individualism. The structuralist method, posed as an alternative to liberal individualism, is a key point of convergence between Marxism and abolition. It carries special resonance for prison abolitionists' challenges to the individualizing logics of criminal law that attaches offenders to their crimes through their identification as criminals, holds them individually responsible for the supposed criminality, and then as punishment de-individualizes them as prisoners. In the public talks and interviews that comprise much of Davis's abolitionist writing, she teaches her audience this structural thinking, this sociological imagination that informs the concept of structural racism and its instantiation in the prison industrial complex. To think the prison industrial complex, no less than to think capitalism, we need to scale up our thinking, to situate structural institutional phenomenon in larger institutional context and think beyond the level of the subject, let alone the individual. And I think prison abolitionism is doing this work brilliantly today. Many academic and activist feminists are arguably out of the practice of thinking on this scale, which is also the scale necessary for what were once US Marxist feminist critical preoccupations, the structures of work and family. Bringing Davis's prison abolitionism from the margins of that Marxist feminist archive to the center can provide a powerful counter to the recent tendencies of feminists to scale down their analyses to the level of individuals, to jobs and families, rather than the institutions that structure their conditions of possibility, that is, the institutions of work and family. So the second element of an abolitionist method, which I want to draw on for Marxist feminist projects of post-work and post-familial politics and thought, is utopianism. The term doesn't reference some impossible blueprint of perfection, but rather an aspiration to imagine better futures, understood as always the necessary horizon of politics. The goal of prison abolitionism are ambitious, taking on a fundamental structure, right, that is articulated and even inextricably linked with other structures, and it won't be easily or quickly accomplished. Prison abolitionism, as with anti-capitalism, is about playing the long game. The agenda of prison abolitionism is unabashedly utopian. To abolish the prison system requires a radical restructuring of the political, economic, and cultural forces that reproduce it. Utopianism here is about imagining futures that are not just more tolerable, that is, reformed, versions of the present. To think abolition requires the cultivation of longer political temporalities and unlearning what Davis calls the left's impatience with protracted struggles, right? And anti-capitalism too, if it's anything, is a protracted struggle. So Davis named feminism and abolitionism as essential theories and practices for the 21st century. And I want to build on, find as many ways as possible to bring them together, including using the power of abolition as method to reanimate the older Marxist feminist agendas of work and family abolitionism. Just as Davis argues, we must struggle to pull apart the seemingly incontrovertible link between illegality and prison, I think feminists need to contest the inevitable link between work and income, and between family and care. To resurrect the call for the anti-capitalist abolition of work and family, these institutions that are supposed to anchor capitalism in our lives, and that are often hailed as the normative alternatives to the prison, right? The salvation for the pre or formerly incarcerated, is to insist that we think more critically about these institutions and more imaginatively about the forms of economic and social cooperation that might replace them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. And last, we have Joy James.
Thank you. And thank you all for those very important interventions. So I'm going to do something maybe a little different. I'm going to start with a poem from Lucille Clifton, a Black poet, author, educator, and parent, who I also identify as a captive maternal. The title of the poem is New Bones. We will wear new bones again. We will leave these rainy days, break out through another mouth into sun and honey time. Worlds buzz over us like bees. We be splendid in new bones. Other people think they know how long life is, how strong life is. We know. So You know, Clifton poetry, Black culture, at least for me, is a source of culture that provides comfort, but also a reawakening in the imagination of what we've inherited. I mean, what we seek are new bones or new structures. And I think that's why we're having this conversation about abolitionism and communism, guided and structured by the important historical information that has been put on the table by political theory to keep things relevant, by the willingness to have open dialogues, discourse, and hopefully debates, but also the desperate need for new bones that can rework what we've inherited in terms of political struggle. So I see this discussion, or at least my contribution to it, about abolitionism and communism as not being able to go anywhere unless I talk about revolutionary struggle. And if I talk about revolutionary struggle as a practice, then I have to contend with the fact of where I'm employed, you know, even though I organize, how that employment sector structures my speech and my thought processes, and who has their hands on the lever, you know, of hegemony in terms of political ideology that even defines these terms. You know, what is abolitionism in the 21st century? What is Marxism? Frank Chapman has a book out that just came out a month ago, Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism. He is the executive director of the National Alliance against racism, political repression, which grew out of the organization that defended Angela Davis and continued doing legal work. But his new book that is out questions some of our academic assumptions about defining Marxism, about defining Black Marxism, right? And so as a former incarcerated person, as a Black communist, a Black Marxism, I'm reading this text as part of our new bones, written by somebody in their 70s, somebody who organizes in Chicago, somebody who works with CFIST, which is a coalition to free people who were framed through a torture mechanism that reminds me of CIA offshore sites for false confessions, right? And it's this constant repetition of violence and dispossession that mandates that we have to wear new bones. But the question for me is, where do we get them from? I am not convinced that the source of analyses unquestionably would come from academic sectors. I would say that in this moment, we have a serious class struggle going on in Black communities. And it's not just against Derek Chauvin, it's not just against white cops, right? It's based on, I'm sorry, I'm really exhausted like everybody else. So my effect might look like I'm laughing. I'm not really laughing. It's like an anger release mechanism. We cannot reach a clear definition because we do not recognize the intellectualism of the working class or the impoverished sectors. So this puts me in a bit of a bind as an academic. Like, based on what authority do I even define these terms if I work, for which I do, and I continue to work until I get retirement, for a wealthy white corporation that's also called a college, right? And for state entities, you're working for the government. Like when I was at UT Austin, you're literally working for the state, right? So it's between the state corporation, the private corporation, the hegemonic way in which we instruct, against, of course, repression, against, of course, reactionary, but our very ability to codify these terms and then distribute them has been monetized. And that is part of the struggle that's going on now. You know, what are the old bones that we've inherited? The Paris Commune of 1871, right? It's 150 years that Marx wrote about at the same time that Black Reconstruction was happening before we were betrayed, and the terror of the Klan and the slavocracy ruling class, joined with the white capitalists of the North, decided to, quote, re-enslave Black people, right? Through the convict prison lease system, through the 13th Amendment, supposed to give you emancipation, but legalizes slavery if you've been, convicted of a crime. And so this is a site of tension right now. The Academy will identify abolitionism as prison abolitionism. The people I know who are organizing, who have their children literally tell me, I've got 2 sons in doing a combined 37 years. They want slavery abolitionism. They want to focus on the 13th Amendment, but there's a debate. They do not have the tools or the networks to distribute their ideas. They have $7,000, literally, they told me 2 weeks ago. We already know we have movement millionaires right now. And there are distribution packets, but they happen within their own networks. This for me is the irony of abolitionism. You can say that Black women delivered democracy, and I just consider that more domestic labor, but I'll take it. It's better than a proto-fascist, to Biden and Harris. But there is no democratic mechanism on the ground to talk to impoverished people, unhoused people. What is abolitionism to you? Like, there's another narrative of the political prisoners, and I'm so glad Sharice mentioned Mumia, but Mumia's inside and ill with COVID. Sundiata Okoli. I mean, there's cancer, there's COVID, not just for those with political risk-taking love, right? But for, I'll call them the civilians, right? Who are disposable through this illness, right? So if we were to engage in revolutionary struggle, who would control the terms of discourse? If revolutionary struggle was the mechanism for freedom, and abolitionism and communism, are methods, methodologies, vehicle, I really don't care at this point, but going back to Amilcar Cabral, the source, the return to the source. We have had so many people transition violently. Civilians, 16-year-old girls shot in the chest, people choked out, but we've also lost Patrice Lumumba, we lost Malcolm, we lost Martin, we lost George Jackson. However you feel about the revolutionaries, they have an agency that is not prevalent or dominant in academic abolitionism. It is sidelined. So where does the agency belong? And I don't want to overstep my time boundaries. But I don't see it being recognized from the impoverished. If they ask for accountability or receipts, if they want to know where multi-million-dollar distributions go, you have to speak with them. This is what Cabral says in Return to the Source. You cannot speak for people, you have to speak with them. And once you speak with them, we collectively learn what we need. If capital is financing our freedom movements, they are not freedom movements. I mean, like an 8th grader, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be snarky, but like, how do you get into a position with, imperial capitalism that it is funding both sides of the table? And how is it that we focus so much on the domestic, which is very important, but if a coup is bad, and I'm glad we started off talking about January 6th, if a coup is bad for the United States, it cannot be good for Haiti. You can't have, us deliver democracy to Biden and Harris and these promissory notes of an evolutionary track towards abolitionist freedom if we cannot control the source of violence. And I'm not just talking about local cops, at ICE, at the FBI, at the CIA, at the State Department, AFRICOM. I mean, the US is still an imperial militarized force destabilizing liberation movements across the globe. So we're in a quandary living in the heart of the empire, belly of the beast, whatever name you want to give it. And that quandary would only, the pressure of it would only be relieved. New bones would only be formed if we could return to the source of the intellectual power of the people who die first and die poor. And I don't think I have anything else to add to that.
Thank you so much, Joy. A powerful end to the panel. I want to give the panelists first an opportunity to respond to each other or to ask questions to each other before we start turning to the Q&A. So if anyone has questions, Kathy, Sylvia, Cherise, Joy, for each other, please unmute yourselves and do so now. Perhaps maybe I can ask an intervening question as you gather your thoughts. I think one of the things that you've all powerfully pointed to is the ways in which abolition has to be an internationalist struggle, and that if we look to both the ways in which the working class is an international and not just a national phenomenon, if we look to the ways that the US produces empire and militarization in other zones, that we have to think on an internationalist terrain about abolition. In the course of organizing with the Cops Off Campus Coalition, though, I've come across a number of people who've expressed certain kinds of hesitations about that, and who suggest that the specificity of the abolitionist genealogy as it arises out of Du Bois and a tradition of abolition democracy that's rooted in a critique of chattel slavery would then say that abolition is not, the perfect fit for thinking about particular challenges to do with mass incarceration and imprisonment in other zones and other contexts. I was wondering if any of you wanted to respond to this and to help us think a little bit about how either using abolition as method or thinking through the combination of abolition and communism helps us to think about the global potential for using abolition as a lens.
I'll just quick. Oh,
Now,
go ahead.
Please.
No, I'll just quickly say, I think that we need to eliminate the false binary between foreign and domestic policy. These are one and the same. Like, if we understand that we live in a settler colonial society and that police are domestic occupying forces, I think we have a better way of connecting the 1033 program, for example, with AFRICOM, with Southcom, with the Indo-Pacific Command, and with the ways in which, especially starting in the 1980s, the export of US style prison systems was a symbol of modernity in the global South. And so even as there are particular patterns to incarceration in the United States because of the US global hegemony and the US war machine and the massive network of US bases and the massive network of US private security forces, patterns of incarceration and carcerality and warehousing of labor and dissidents, I think permeates throughout the globe. Surely we need to understand how this is operating in specific localities, but I think that the ways how US imperialism operates, in my perspective, whether it's through sanctions, through coups, through military bases, through aid, through oppressive trade regimes, all of these are indicative of carceral structures and carceral systems. And so in my perspective, we can definitely think about abolishing US police. And mind you, the US police are often trained by Israeli police forces. So they are internationalists in their scope, right? So as Jacqueline Luqman has said, the capitalists are internationalists, the ruling class are internationalists. And so when we also need to expand our cartography of struggle, right? We also need to expand the ways in which we understand policing and carcerality, because it is a global project, even as it has local enunciations.
Beautiful. Kathy, did you want to come in?
Yeah. I mean, I just another way to think of it, because I was thinking about Teresa's notion of this cartography of struggle, which I think is a really useful way. And another concept that works for me in thinking about this is cycle of struggle as a way to think about movements, in particular intensive periods. People have thought about this in terms of a cycle of struggle, but for me, it's useful to think about how movements can communicate across borders. So this idea that, this person who is responding to you, Charmaine, was saying, well, it's based on a kind of local history, and how could that be relevant to other places? And I think it's important to respect the specificity of movements that arise in particular places out of particular histories and situations of struggle. But I think that we find throughout history that these movements have been able to communicate with other kinds of movements. It doesn't mean that they become identical, but that they share sort of strategies or methods or rituals of, of protest, or kinds of analyses or concepts that can be used and inform other struggles in other places. So for me, cycle of struggle is useful because it takes the pressure off some kind of international movement being unified and the same. And so these are separate struggles and they have different histories, but that doesn't mean that they don't communicate and they can't learn from one another. And so I think it's sort of, it's this false notion that there's local struggles or global struggles. There's always a kind of articulation and a communication among them. And I think abolition has a lot of potential to do some of that work and communicate to other struggles that might not be, exactly have the same kind of language or history or even targets. So.
This is Joy. I would agree that it's a false dichotomy conceptually. But if you look at the politics and practice, I would ask, how often do we take on US foreign policy? It doesn't really please the donors to nonprofits if you do. So the question becomes, like, we're aware, as Frank Chapman says, there is no national working class, there's an international working class, because goods and the exploitation of labor just radiates across borders, because the capitalists are internationalists, as everybody's pointed out. The question I'm asking a couple of questions to myself included. Do our movements clearly articulate not just the concept, but do they put in play politics that would offend donors once we start going for foreign policy change? Like, nobody really challenged Obama on AFRICOM. I mean, it was started by Bush, but Obama expanded it. Of course, we challenged Trump on everything because he was a white supremacist sexual predator. That was easy. It's when, the gloss of we care about human rights, that's when it becomes more tricky. Like, if it is true, based on the reporting that I'm seeing, that the current administration is deporting more Haitians than Trump did, where's the national outcry that says, you agreed to the coup in Haiti and now you're deporting people back to Haiti to be disappeared? I don't hear it. Maybe I'm in the wrong circuits. So I want to read a quote quickly and then I'll stop. This is from Jalil Muntaqim, who a number of us organized, a lot of people, did a lot more labor, but, a number of us organized to get out of prison after 49 years. But he's the one that led me, like 20 years ago, to start anthologizing political prisoners. And what I was told by political prisoners, I want to set it up before I read it, is most academics were not going to approach them because their agency was so clearly in opposition to the state. And so there is like this suffering prisoner that you can embrace because their political agency is their victimization. And then there's the political who were actually Marxists. They were Black communists, right? So their ideological template was totally coherent with our analyses, but their practice, since, COINTELPRO was trying to kill them, was outside the scope that the academy could approve of. So this is what Jalil Muntaqim says in a April 22, I guess that was yesterday, New Republic Review. Quote, they exploit the name and the legacy of the Black Panther Party without any credence or any true thought to the idea of those who are still suffering from COINTELPRO convictions, and those of us who are elderly now and suffer from age and without any means of surviving. Our circumstances in terms of being exploited in the name of the Black Panther Party are horrendous. They're not providing any services or support for these aging Panthers, but they'll take the name, they'll take the legacy of the Panthers and exploit it, profit off of it, end quote. So this could be spoken of in terms of Hollywood production, in terms of marketing, you know, attire, but also the very concept itself of struggle and rebellion can be captured by the bourgeoisie and repurposed against revolutionaries. And I don't really see an analysis of that being amplified inside the academy.
Well, I want to add a couple of things, only so small, that, yeah, I don't, you know, I basically don't see how we can struggle locally without struggling internationally. You cannot free yourself on a local level if at the same time, in some ways, we are complicitous, you know, with politics that are destroying movement, they are exploiting people abroad. This, you know, as has been said, capitalism is international. And you can see also the circulation is through imperial conquest that continues day by day, that the power structure, the American government gets its power to exploit local communities. You know, exploiting Africa, Latin America, the mining company and so on. There is a connection between that exploitation that takes place across the world and what happens in each community. There is a very material connection. And also there's a connection in personnel. It's very interesting. I've been, you know, looking at what is happening in the jails and you know, death row. So many of the jailers of today, of the people who are employed in the jails, are people who were, you know, officers and so on in some army in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and et cetera, et cetera. They come home and they go into the jail and they bring, or they go into the police and they bring to the demonstration the same kind of tactics, the same kind of brutality that they've used against people abroad. So there is a profound connection. And that's why I think, you know, part of organizing on the local level is also to create a situation, to create a politics that says no complicity, no support, you know, to any initiative of the government, any initiative of the corporations that goes and exploits and kills and builds what we're talking about, hundreds of jails that the United States has across the world. They have girdled. There is a belt around the world of jails built by the US. So it's one struggle.
I just wanted to quickly add the idea that of militarization of the police is redundant. They're already a domestic occupying force, but we also need in terms of building off what Dr. Fedorici was saying, there's a way, the militarization of the police through equipment, it conveys how the war machine is both domestic and global. So to mention the 1033 program, again, this is the selling of tanks, the bang grenades, mace, like all of these technologies of war to be used against quote unquote riots. And as we know, the foundation of this is the 1968 Safe Streets Act under Johnson, who was responding to what? Black rebellion. And the work on anti-communism is important here because what was formed were called red squads, right? These red squads, which gathered surveillance and intelligence, were being funded and supplied these war weapons by the federal government. And always with these Black rebellions, it was this idea of outside agitation or some type of communist plot that was undergirding this Black rebellion. And so all of that to say, the constant circulation of weaponry, of techniques, we cannot forget about the techniques. And so there's a report that the kneeling on George Floyd's neck that Chauvin used is a Cobb McGraw technique. It is a technique that Israeli soldiers use. And so the training of US police forces by Israeli soldiers is very important because we see it manifested and weaponized against domestic occupied peoples, colonized peoples, that is to say racialized, oppressed, and poor people. And so we have to have an I don't think you could be an abolitionist without being an anti-imperialist because these things are so intertwined.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I have one more invitation, and then we're going to open up. In the chat, there were a lot of comments going on as Dr. James was making her remarks, particularly around the need to center the intellectualism of the working class. And one of the things that seems inevitable about our panel and the position in which we all are is that we're all academics in primarily white supremacist higher education institutions. And so I just wanted to maybe kind of center what Joy was bringing up in terms of the kind of persistent ways in which both our institutions are engaged in the carceral state, but also the ways in which, you know, the centering of academic analyses persistently make it more difficult to think about what it means to build an abolitionist communist movement that's grounded above all in the working classes. So I wonder if anybody would like to, you know, respond about the kind of conundrum we're all in being placed within the institutions that we are.
Well, I want to say something that because this is a question that, you know, for a long time I faced, because I've done a lot of work around the question of education, struggling, you know, being involved in struggles over education, particularly against the privatization of education, particularly against the introduction of fees, etc., etc. And at times, both here and also abroad, and at times many people, you know, say, well, what's the point? You know, what's the point? Since we know the universities are involved with the power structure, we should just leave them and go outside. And I feel a lot of sympathy for that argument, but I've always, in the end, decided not to. And it seems to me that the university are a place of struggle, and the university have been built with a lot of resources that workers have worked for, that people have been exploited for. And the question is not necessarily to leave them, but also to struggle within them, and to struggle at all levels, and also to open them up and to use the resources that the university have, to use them for the community. And that's what, when I've been involved, I'm retired now, but I've been involved in the academic world. And I remember, you know, times in which when I was working at Ulster, for example, that the campus is seated in the middle of a big immigrant community. And so, you know, there was an effort that I think was important to connect with that community, to have people from the community to come in, to have students do things that would, you know, benefit, you know, to not simply remain within the question of, you know, the walls of the university, but actually go outside and see how the resources that are there can be used. Unfortunately, every place you're going to be in this capitalist society, it's going to be a place of contradiction. I mean, you are in a workplace and you're working for companies. You are at Amazon. You either leave it, or but every place you have the same contradiction. And the question is, how do you build on that and, you know, build forms of solidarity? And also, again, the problem is when, you know, the people stay within the camp. I think the 60s, for instance, was very powerful. You know, the people went into the community from the universities, you know, connected, for example, with places that were protesting the recruitment of soldiers in Vietnam, and etc. So that's my contribution.
I agree that, you know, we work where we are as best as we can, with as, you know, as much commitment and as much humility, right? That really isn't, you know, supported much in the academy. Well, when you were speaking, Sylvia, I thought of Ida B. Wells. She's on the cover of Frank Chapman's book, The Marxist-Leninist Perspectives in Black Liberation. And I always considered Wells to be an ancestor. But I think when I see these stages of her life, and I'll try to be brief, I think it really from, you know, the 19th century, it is a mirror for the 21st century. So her parents are born in slavery, they die, she becomes the first literate person, she's 15, she makes herself older to support her orphaned, siblings. She becomes a school teacher. She morphs from that to becoming a journalist of sorts. Once her 2-year-old goddaughter's father is killed in a lynching, like in Memphis in 1892, she becomes an anti-lynching activist. So she is self-taught as an intellectual, and she will have this formidable impact across the globe. She'll go to Britain. We talked about internationalism. She'll organize a boycott against Tennessee cotton. But this is also the contradiction I was trying to deal with. She's literally self-taught, but there are folks, Du Bois, who has a doctorate from Harvard, Mary Church Terrell, who went to Oberlin, et cetera, who through the academy, the white dominant elite academy that is a product of capitalism, right? Will censor Wells, as well as the white donor, Mary Ovington. So when you come to the foundation of the NAACP, right? For, the National Alliance for whatever colored people, advancement, sorry, of colored people. When you have that founding conference, the white donors say, Wells is too militant. I mean, she literally will risk her life to support sharecroppers, poor people, stop lynchings. She puts her body on the line. She's too close to the mass, right? And so she's basically pushed out of this, the anti-lynching movement is what sparks the NAACP. And so later in his memoirs, Du Bois will write, when he's about to be pushed out for his communism, I wish I had like a radical, spirit to ride with me. And I'm reading, I was like, you had Wells, but you're compromised by the structure and by funding to distance from these intellectuals who are the source of our rebellions. The rebel intellectuals are not really coming from the academy. The question is, what is our relationship as academics to the rebel intellectuals? This is Cabral's source. And I'm not asking for like a Bible on how to do it or a template, but I want to be totally candid. When people try to do it, it would be really nice that if you're not going to support those endeavors, not to trash them. And so it's like Kathleen Cleaver said in an interview with Henry Louis Gates in '98. The Black community pretended like we had a united front across class. We're talking about communism. Let's talk about the Black bourgeoisie's relationship to the Black working class, or the so-called lumpen proletariat. We pretended we were united because of white supremacy. White supremacy will lynch everybody in your family, so we're gonna put on a united front. The reality is that capitalism dominates politics in the United States and all ethnic racial groups. So how we return to the source, I keep going back to Cabral, we would have to be transparent about where the power of the bourgeoisie and where the power of academic intellectuals come from, in order to align with, guerrilla intellectuals like Walter Rodney, who was an academic, but then lost his life, because he was struggling with poor working class people. And I don't see that transparency or even a clear desire, or discussion on how we would even deprogram ourselves and give up our power.
Yeah, I was definitely going to bring up
Myself,
Walter.
sorry.
I was definitely going to, Walter Rodney said that basically academics are enemies of the people until proven otherwise. And I think that until proven otherwise, we can either capitulate to the structures of the university or live up to that until proven otherwise. And I think that Walter Rodney embodied that with his groundings, for example, in Jamaica with Rastafari. But two people that, the two people that I study and admire are William Alpheus Hunton and Doxy Wilkerson, both of who were professors at Howard University, both of who left their teaching posts at Howard University. Doxy Wilkerson to join the Communist Party, and William Alpheus Hunton to work full-time for the Council on African Affairs. And so they made their decisions. And I think more and more about them as the Procrustean dilemma, so to speak, arises between, do you stay in the academy and try to redistribute resources and redistribute access and be in it but not of it, so to speak, or do you leave that behind and join these, join movements and join organizations? But as we've seen, activists and organizers become part of the niggerati too, so to speak, right? So the niggerati is a term that comes from the Harlem Renaissance that is about the elite of the Harlem Renaissance. Carol Boyce Davies says I have to always mention that every time I say niggerati. So anyway, but so what Jackie Luqman calls a cattle activist. So it's not as if it's only the academics are being co-opted and are being and are sort of throwing dirt in the eyes of the struggle, so to speak, right? So I think, you can work, if you work at McDonald's, you're still upholding the corporatocracy, right? You're still participating, like as Dr. Fedorici said, we can't get out of it. And so it's like, what do you do until we abolish work, right? What do you do with the type of work that you do? And how is it that you don't confuse, influence with struggle, and you don't confuse sort of participating in, lending your voice to a struggle for doing the actual work in ways that actually drown out, as Dr. James is mentioning, guerrilla intellectuals, right, that don't have degrees. So.
But Cherise, I need to ask you something, right? I mean, so the person who works at McDonald's, they're forced to work at, maybe somebody wants to work at McDonald's, but the exploitation on that level, expropriation of your labor, you're exhausted, like it's not really, it's a different class status. And isn't it a different reward benefit? Unless the person who works at McDonald's, the person just came out of jail, becomes a symbolic representation of poverty, exploited worker, and that can become a hustle and a gig. But the structure of the hustle, doesn't it flow from capital?
Yeah, so my point is not to equate somebody who works at McDonald's for minimum wage or less than minimum wage with academics. My point is we have to work. And what are the values, the ethics, and the commitments that we embody in whatever work that we do? And so I don't know. And so as somebody who works in academia, that is a constant question that I have to ask myself, like, how do we participate alongside what's happening beyond the academy? Because we have to work. Theoretically, you don't have to do anything, I guess, but be Black and die. But in my estimation, you have to work, right? And so how is it that we do that with an eye toward realizing that constantly we serve as ways, we being academics serve as ways to reify and reproduce the system? How do we constantly struggle against that? Again, that is the until proven otherwise that Walter Rodney offered up. So that's just what I was saying. I wasn't making a equivalence.
I'm going to go to questions now, if that's okay. Hopefully these keep coming back into the conversation. So there's a question from Sawad Salem, and he's asking about, as abolitionists and Marxist feminists, what is the capacity of abolitionist movements to actively defend our communities from patriarchal and racialized violence, particularly in the forms of assault, rape, and harassment? And then there's a related question that asks, in relationship, how do we think about abolitionist thinking as a form of traveling theory? Do you all think there are ways in which the centrality of patriarchy as a unique structural and structuring form of domination is elided as theories of abolition based in the US and North America become popularized worldwide? How might this relate to the need to re-articulate what abolition is in other geopolitical and historical contexts? In other words, in on-the-ground abolitionist work and not an academic abolitionism.
Well, I will reply to the first question and very briefly say that, one way to respond to the question is to look at the many efforts that have been taking place and are taking place now across the country. I'm thinking, for example, of organizations like Inside and other organizations, Women Will Be Fighting Against Violence Against Women, who have been precisely dealing with that issue, So going beyond what Angela Davis calls a carceral feminism, and at the same time, having to finding alternative structures. And of course, this has been a very, very, laborious and difficult process, because we come in community which are very divided. And, if we want to create, structures of accountability at the community level, so that we don't have to call the police, so we don't have to resort, to, basically, forces of occupation. Then, how do we organize, above all in a situation which so many communities have been shredded? We speak of community, but actually in many cases, there is no such a thing. And in a way, the community has to be reconstituted. In other words, infrastructures of accountability have to be. And I was referring, before, some of the efforts that a number of feminist organizations have been making, in trying to understand, and also some, men's organization. I mean, in New York, for example, for a number of years, there was an organization that tried to use the structures of indigenous people, the form of indigenous people, restorative justice, to deal with people, comrades, activists, who nevertheless behave in a social, sexually abusive way, with the argument that instead of immediately condemning them or expelling them, they could also be reintegrated. And what structure, what infrastructure do we need to build that? I think that this is an important issue. As we are speaking of abolition on a broad level, obviously ultimate abolition, we want the abolition of the capitalist system, but abolition has many, many levels, as we heard all through this discussion. At the very immediate level, there is the question of what to do, what kind of community restructuring we need to bring about in order to, in fact, not have to deal with all the institution of repression. And I think that now we have experiences that we can learn from. It's not an easy process, but we have experiences of how we can actually bring together different forms of organization to create structures of accountability.
I would say, thanks for that. And so just to be candid, I've done the Black Feminist Reader. I edited the Angela Y. Davis Reader. I don't really do Black feminism anymore for a reason. I don't think it has the capacity to grapple with the issue of violence under captivity. In part, I think, I've been saying the same thing since we got together, that the middle class, the bourgeoisie, controls definitional norms, and that Black feminism in its most popular form, to me, appears to be bourgeois feminism. So the reason I've been thinking about the captive maternal for the last 5 years has been about the conditions that Sylvia referenced, right? In the larger statements that she had made about the right to decent education, about the ability to feed your kids, the ability to go to the store at night and not get raped, or go to the store in the morning and not get raped, right? And so this constant pressure, need, and desire to protect self and family, I feel, has been a function, not an identity. But the reason why I'm not sure that gender, as I used to write about it, still works is I think about Attica. And again, this is the 50th anniversary. So I see 4 stages of the captive maternal. Like, one, they're literally in the prison, and they're not all, quote, men. They just happen to be in a male prison because the state gave them designation of male, right? So if they're trans, if they're non-binary, it's not going to be recognized by the state. But once inside, they function on the level of conflicted caretakers. They're the trustees. They keep the whole thing running. They're cleaning it. They're making food. They're, they're doing gardening. And this is typical domestic work of women. But they're also doing this surplus labor. They sing to each other, they care for each other when they're ill, they tell jokes, they educate each other, they teach them how to read. They are each other's lovers, and sometimes they're rapists too. Like, all the vulnerabilities that women suffer disproportionately and girls. Under the zone of captivity, gender doesn't really function, the way it would in the so-called free world. If Black people have never been freed, then the question is, when has it ever really worked for us? So the first level is caretaker. The second level is a protest. They like, we're humans or men. You can't call us the N-word. We're not working for 27 cents an hour. They do their protests. It moves into a maroon camp when they take over the prison. That's a third step, is marronage. You create community. The fourth step is that the state, the capitalist imperialist democracy, never agrees to Black freedom. So your assertion of human rights is seen as a declaration of war against the state. And so the fourth state, the stage becomes you're a war resistor. So literally the National Guard is sent in by Rockefeller to shoot through white prison guards to kill Black rebels. That is totally irrational if white life has sanctity, but it is totally logical if the ultimate goal is to suppress Black people. That the captive has no gender, that they perform domestic duties, usually as labor of housework, right, that women are geared to, means that under the constraints of an anti-Black captive zone, traditional feminist theory does not have the analytical capacity to deal with the levels of violence that radiate across age, across genders, and across political ideologies. So the last thing I was at, I've been in conversation with the Kurdish women who literally are in a war, and they talk about democratizing violence, which I think is incredibly controversial because our ethical high ground is that we're not violent. But like, how did African Americans get free? Du Bois says 200,000 fought in the Civil War. So I think there's a lot of contradictions here around violence that we don't have the space to discuss.
Thank you, Joy. We have 143 questions with apologies.
So sorry, I have to leave. I said that I would have to leave at 4:30. I'm so sorry. Great, greetings to everybody, and it was great to be here with all of you. All the
Thank you
best.
so much for being here, Sylvia.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Okay, so we have 143 questions. With apologies, we're not going to be able to get to them all, but I'm trying to combine a number of them in some forms. So the first is just, primarily to Kathy, although others are welcome to come in. There's a question here from Nicole Sagal. I'd love to hear Kathy comment on the idea that we have to work, or the meaning of work, and the possible abolition of work. And then I think in a slightly related form, Madeline wanted to hear you elaborate on your emphasis on the methodological, and if you could elaborate in relation to Sylvia Fedorici's point about the need for a constructivist element in current struggles. In other words, the need to build democratic forms towards self-governance.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, about the abolition of work. I think, and this is one of the ways I think maybe prison abolitionism is very instructive too, to recognize, the disciplinary character of a lot of these institutions that are meant to try to sort of manage either, what they see necessary populations or surplus populations. And I think of both work and family as those kinds of disciplinary institutions that are trying to construct an exploitable workforce. And I think that's what work is too. So, I think for me, work, I think it's important to recognize that work, right, which is a general requirement, of income generating activity. And for most of us, that does mean work, not for everyone, because there's not enough work to go around. But that work is not economically necessary. Work as a requirement for every individual, let alone for a lifetime, that's not necessary for the production of social wealth. Right? That's a disciplinary choice, right? That's a political maneuver as a way to try to organize populations and to subdue them according to the needs of this larger system. So we don't need to work. Not everyone needs to work. Not everyone needs to work for a lifetime in order to produce the kind of social wealth even that we enjoy now. So I think it's important to kind of recognize work as a disciplinary apparatus, right? Rather than imagine that it is, some kind of economic necessity. And I think part of this is trying to think about, in order to contest it at that level, I think we need to try to loosen. This is a sort of, I guess a reformist strategy with the utopian horizon of abolition of work, is to loosen the link between income and work, right? Which is now pretty ironclad for most people. I mean, there have to be other ways to distribute income, right? Rather than work, because obviously there's not even enough work to go around, let alone work at anything approaching a living wage. And yet we still imagine that there is some kind of economic necessity to it. So part of the abolition of work, as I understand it, is about eliminating it, right, in the way that we know work now, as a kind of requirement on every individual and for a lifetime. And so some of the moves to try to get towards this are about reducing hours, about breaking or relaxing the link between work and income so that we find other ways to distribute necessary income to people besides work, and to reveal work for what it is, right? It's not, Sarah Jaffe has this great book called Work Won't Love You Back. It just won't, right? Especially most forms of jobs, and it will not sustain you, right? And so I think we have to really sort of think much more critically about work as an institution in that way, and recognize it as a disciplinary institution rather than a sort of an economically rational system of income allocation. And then the other one was, what was the other one?
I think the other one was for you to invite you to comment on Sylvia's understanding of a kind of constructivist approach to abolition, the building of democratic forms of self-governance.
Yeah, no, and I think that is, and part of what I'm interested in, and this is my preoccupation that I'm bringing to this forum, is about getting people to think more structurally and institutionally, because we have so few opportunities to think this way. We always think about, individual is the default unit of analysis, and we think about particular individuals, and it's very hard for us to recognize patterns, right? And so, even this concept of structural racism, which is finally getting some purchase, is a difficult concept for people because it's not visible. It's not in an individual sort of attitude. There's nothing that you can pin it on in that way. Like structures, right? Institutions, which are the forces that structure our lives, are just really hard to think. And so part of the reason I'm really excited about prison abolitionism is it's a pedagogy. Like, in order to think it, like to make sense of the demand to abolish the prison, you have to be able to think about it structurally, right? And not in terms of individuals and their culpability or lack of culpability, right? And I think it's that I think is really, really necessary. And so part of when we think about, the kind of a post-abolition world, is we have to think about how to create structures, and Sylvia called them structures of accountability, alternative structures, but we do need certain kinds of institutions and patterns, right, in order to help, facilitate our relationships with them and to hold people accountable. So I think that is I think that, again, thinking in terms of structures and institutions is crucial, I think, for thinking both abolition and post-abolition.
Charisse, I wonder if I can invite you to respond here, because there have been a lot of questions about the role of the state in abolitionist efforts. So some of them are about, the question of whether horizons of communism and abolition leave space for transitional socialist state power, in which authority is seen as a necessary power for the repression of capitalist and imperialist forces. So does abolition require the state? Does communism require the state? What do you think?
Yeah, I think in stagist understandings, right? And so classical or orthodox Marxist understanding, socialism, the difference between socialism and communism is the withering away of the state, whereas socialism is a sort of nationalized, state-run entity whereby the state is facilitated and controlled by the proletariat. I think that because the nation state is ultimately the container of capitalism, right? The Westphalian nation state, which currently structures the international order, I don't think that can hold abolitionist or true socialist possibility long term. I think that perhaps it's a necessary pit stop, or, but I think many of the malformations that we've seen in socialist societies have been because these are socialist states in the context of a capitalist world economy. And so we either need to think more locally or have a truly global social mode of socialist or communist organizing. But I do think that the nation state in and of itself is a carceral or captive entity. That's obviously at a particular level of abstraction. I don't know what that looks like in other than sort of struggles like the Zapatista struggles, organizations like, or potentialities like the struggle of the World Social Forum in 2000 against against the World Economic Forum. I think that those are either harbingers or flashes of forms of economic and political organizing beyond the nation state. And it seems to me that that is what's necessary for abolition, because the state as an entity is the arbiter of violence and has the monopoly on violence, and facilitates and metes out violence against its own population and other populations. So, but I think that in the interim, right, that the other thing about abolition to me and about communism to me is organizing and struggle, that it's the process, right? And so it's not as if we have to collapse the state in order to realize abolition. It's how do abolitionist horizons move toward the collapse of the state and move toward a mode of communist organizing beyond the sort of Westphalian nation state apparatus. So that's what I got.
Thank you. There's also been a good number of questions about organizational form. So I'll read a couple of them. George Jackson wrote about the construction of the commune as essential to any revolutionary communist project. How is the commune as a communist project connected to the aims of abolition? And then other questions about organizational forms. In this session, there have been critiques of the nonprofit industry and its supposedly positive role in abolitionist politics and struggles. What do panelists see as the most productive organizational form in abolitionist and communist politics today? Is there a role for the party or otherwise formalized membership organizations? Can unions be effective vehicles for anti-racist, communist, and abolitionist revolutionary organizing, given that the hierarchies of racial capitalism are often reproduced within the union structure? Or are all forms of organization doomed? Is spontaneity the only path to liberation?
I would say all forms of organization are relevant. It just becomes the integrity of the organization. I mean, we're always organizing, like we're organizing and deciding which books to teach in our classes, how much power we will relinquish so our students could shape their own trajectory of education. I mean, it's interesting to raise George Jackson. So I just want to be clear, in my studies, he's actually the architect of 21st century abolitionism. But because of his methodology, once guards told him they were going to kill him, he was not palatable. So I've been to conferences. My background is political philosophy, wrote on Hannah Arendt. I got introduced to abolitionism by Davis, years later. And so this became a political passion, not like a research. I think I would be better competent if I actually had studied and researched it. But I've been at conferences, like as a political philosopher, and heard Black graduate students say that they wanted to write a dissertation on George Jackson, and they were told by their professors they could not. So again, I'm going to hit that one note about discrediting of thought and agency that comes from certain sectors. So I think any type of organizing is valid. It is the recognition of the intellectual chops or agency of the organizer. I mean, if we do create this schemata, right, like you give us your raw labor as an organizer, or your raw story of you lost a child to the police, or your raw story of being incarcerated, right? If that becomes the raw material to process and to, create a kind of factory production, then all forms of organizing under that template would be invalid. Any form of organizing outside of it would be valid. Last thing on Jackson. I mean, he warned about the desire for prestige and power. And, I'm always trying to check myself because I'm in a very competitive industry. Like, you're supposed to be one of the smartest persons in the room, the most polished in your speech, whatever, that gives you credibility. When did your last book come out? So on and so forth. So if prestige and power is what eviscerates our organizing, then we would have to have a mechanism of care for each other. We talk about therapeutic care that would check the drive for prestige and power. And the last thing I would say, really, if he says that from the side of prison, this is proto-fascist or fascist, and academics say from the side of the academy, no, it's not really, we can fix this, then I don't see how we reach a consensus without academics using their leverage from their elevated site to become the interpreters of what Jackson really meant. And if it sounds, a lot like what they said, it's not fascist, so we don't have to think about organizing around those, conditions, because those material conditions don't exist, then, we just danced around in a circle rather than a dialectical spiral.
Kathy or Charisse, did you want to respond, or should I ask another question? No, okay.
I just want to say, join an organization, period, and struggle within your organization to form it in a way that is rooted in the campaigns and the struggles that are relevant to the communities in which you're working, but join an organization, period, and engage in political education.
Super. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And so it's hard to pick one, but I think we'll end with this. If we are to listen to the Black proletariat, what did we hear last summer? That seemed like a moment of a very principled enunciation in the burning of the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis. Are we right now being adequate to that demand, that thought, that theoretical development, and what it asks us to do? And I maybe want to add here, just because I'm seeing a lot of comments from Minneapolis here, that, Minneapolis is currently under a war state with National Guard surrounding people on every turn, right? So in the aftermath of the burning of the 3rd Precinct, there's been massive counter-revolutionary movement to shut down further possibility for struggle in Minneapolis. So perhaps to ask you, what did we hear last summer, and what is an organizing that is adequate to that demand in a way that also responds to the immense forces of counter-revolution that come in its wake?
I think we need to be careful about that hearing, right? Because much of what we heard is not rooted in the Black proletariat, subproletariat, lumpen proletariat. What we heard is rooted in the Black petty bourgeoisie. So it's not just what you hear, right? It's what you tap into, right? And which experiences. And so Dr. James has been talking about this all afternoon. Because we live in a capitalist society, and because the mainstream media is the tool of the capitalist society, we cannot necessarily believe or trust what it is that we hear, right? There's also large petty bourgeois elements present in those struggles. And so I think that that's a question that has to be asked in a localized way. And I think that the repression tells us a lot about what was important about those struggles. I'm always paying attention to the repression, because the repression is very targeted towards what is seen as most violent. So the attacks on property, right? So we also have to think about these voter repression laws that sprang up, right? That sprang up because of the historic voter turnout. We have to look at the criminalization of protests that's happening, for example, in Florida, right? That any insult to police officers can result is a felony. And so I think, I guess for me, thinking structurally, I really study the repression, right? And study the ways in which the government is, and federal, state, and local governments are clamping down and making the space of struggle even more dangerous and even more violent. So I think the way that we know what the proletariat told us, Black proletariat told us, is to talk to the Black proletariat. Right? Don't talk to us. I'm an academic. Don't ask me. I don't know. Right? I wasn't participating in those struggles in that way. I was helping my students organize to make demands on the institution. And so, like, talk to people. But also pay attention to the ways that the state is coming down because as a result of these rebellions and uprisings. I think that that's really, really important and require examination and adjustment.
Kathy, Joy?
Yeah, I would, thanks, Charisse. I mean, I agree with everything Charisse said. I will, state the obvious. These are very dangerous times. So we understood the outrage on January 6th was, at least my reading, is when middle-class white people realized, like, oh, this is what it's like to be a Black person. Not literally, right, but for a moment of terror. Like, everything is beyond your control. You don't control your physical security. Anything could flip and then you're in an alternative universe. Well, I mean, so we've lived this for centuries, right? And you always have the talk with your kids to say, we cannot control the levels of violence. And as much as I love you, I can't really protect you. So try, A, B, and C. If that doesn't work, try 1, 2, and 3. Like, this is what I keep saying about the captive. But the captive always rebels. I think we should have longevity in our rebellion. So as Charisse says, you figure that out on the ground. Like, these like kill a Black person and walk, however performative or real the Chauvin verdict was, you still have the 16-year-old bleeding out on the sidewalk. So figure out security. That has to be primary. That is what we did in Reconstruction. We had Black marshals. I come from a military family. Unfortunately, he was working for Empire, but we always understood the material conditions of survival. So whatever the promises are, they remain abstract until they deliver. Unless somebody can guarantee that your child is going to live to be 80 and they don't have a conversation with you, I just will be clear, you don't have to listen to them. It's exactly as Charisse says. If people come and talk to you, with you, beside you, and figure out, if we've been talking about what kind of fortress is the academy that can maybe, help engineer longevity as people move towards freedom. But ultimately, the state is going to do what it's always done. The same thing it did at Attica. Any bid for freedom is seen as a violation of law. And so since we already have hundreds of years of that experience with some modicum of gains and then retrenchment and then a few more gains, voter suppression, go back. I mean, we have new bones. Like Lucille Clifton said, we're going to get new bones, but we have to do it across class solidarity. And of course, that always means some element of multiracial coalition. But the people who live the conditions, they get the new bones first because they're forced to grow them under the state of siege.
Lovely.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I agree with what everyone says. And it's the crucial problem, right? Is what Joy was saying about, the longevity of our rebellion. How do you sustain? I don't think you can sustain the kind of mobilization we saw in the summer forever. Mobilizations will kind of come and go. There's a certain kind of rhythm to these things too. And given the level of repression, the size of the mobilization and the level of repression, there will be concessions made. There will be reforms that you can get out of it. And, part of what abolitionists taught us is that you can't settle for those reforms and you can't mistake those reforms for any kind of goal. And so you have to, I don't know, this is the crucial question for me, is how do you create longevity in a rebellion, right? And how not to get disheartened by the inevitable ebb of mobilization, and how do you kind of have the organizational supports that's going to help nurture it when it comes up again, right? And not let it be kind of bought off by any kind of reform. And I don't think, I think people are pretty smart about that. And I think no one assumes that the kind of reforms that we're seeing now at the levels of cities and states about cutting back on budgets and this kind of thing, I don't think anyone mistakes it for what was being demanded. I think reforms might be useful because they allow then a new ground in which to organize the next stage in the struggle, right? It's not an endpoint, but it might give you some resources in some ways to struggle again. But I don't know, the question of longevity of struggles, I think, is the most urgent question for me right now. And I don't have any easy answers for it. But that's part of what I'm trying to think about, what it means to be in it for the long haul. Like, what does that mean? How does it look like? How do you sustain that? How do you allow individuals to come in and out of movements, according to their own, rhythms and needs? And what are the organizational forms that are going to allow that, are going to be sustained over time? And I don't know the answers.
I just want to say that long-term rebellion is revolution. So James and Grace Lee Boggs write about this in Evolution and Revolution, the difference between insurrection, uprising, and rebellion. And they do that in contradistinction to revolution. So long-term rebellion with objective demands and direction is revolution. So, okay.
That is a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much for a beautiful conversation. There have been so many notes in the chat that this has been life-giving, life-changing, that we don't get to have this conversation often about abolition and communism, particularly for feminists who have centered an analysis of what it means to do this work. So let me just finish with two quick shout outs. The first is that for those of you who are rooted in institutions, Abolition May is a month, as Joshua mentioned, of demanding cops off campus. We start May 3rd with a mass National Day of Refusal, so no attending classes, no teaching. And if you would join us in that, the more people hop on board, the more campuses hop on board, the more powerful the force of our demands are. And if you would like to join us, I dropped copsoffcampuscoalition.com in the chat. And then finally, since we ended with Minneapolis, I just want to give a shout out to comrades who are doing a lot of organizing around those currently incarcerated because of burning at the 3rd Precinct, and Jaleel Stallings, Dylan Robinson, Amina McCaskill. Many people are currently serving time for what they did at the 3rd Precinct. And so if you would think about sending them commissary money or supporting and writing to them, I've just dropped a link in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for being here. Take care, you all, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
And I hope you all also join me in thanking Charmaine for moderating this event. In addition to our 4 panelists, Sylvia had to leave early, but thank you, Kathy, Charisse, Joy, Sylvia, and Charmaine for doing this labor. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate it at the seminar, at the DHI. It was lovely to see you all one way or another, with "see" always in quotation marks in this weird scene. But we appreciate it, and we hope to continue this exchange and this discussion. Thanks again, everyone, so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. That was awesome. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time.